Well, thank you, Karen. You're too kind, at least in public. I really want to take a moment before I start to thank Karen for the incredible amount of work she has done on these issues over a very long period of time, when no one else cared about the civil liberties issues related to counterterrorism, when no one else was looking at counterterrorism and its overlap with cybersecurity. When the academic landscape was bleak, there was Karen. So thank you. How many of you were at the RSA convention last week? Two? That's all? Good. 3. All right. So I can give the same talk? No. Let me try to frame my remarks this morning about cyber security and civil liberties with 10 propositions. That should make it easier for you to pick them apart. The first one is a proposition that I noticed on a large billboard by the side of the highway as I drove in from San Francisco Airport to the city. And in enormous letters on this black background, white letters, the billboard said, "They will get in." And of course, it was a cybersecurity company advertising. But it's the truth. And that is the fundamental truth that frames our discussion today. If you take away nothing else from our discussion today, take away that. They will get in. That's the first proposition. No network is secure. We read in the newspaper yesterday that President Obama's emails were read by the Russian government. If his emails are being read, you can trust that everybody else's can be as well. The Verizon study, which I look forward to every year on breaches of corporations, came out 2 weeks ago. And for those of you who don't read it every year when it comes out or haven't read it yet this year, get it. The Verizon study on breaches of corporations. What it shows this year is that over 70% of the companies that were breached last year didn't know they were breached until someone else told them. And that someone else was almost always the US government. Sometimes it was the FBI knocking on the door, but usually it was the FBI using NSA-derived information. 70% of the corporations didn't know they were breached, but were. And then take a look at another study done by the FireEye Corporation, the Mandiant Corporation, about the average length of time companies had been breached before they noticed, or before they were told. This is the average figure. The average figure was 279 days. Think of the damage you can do, think of the information you can collect in 279 days. That's the average. There are outliers. One particular organization had been breached for 7 years before it figured it out. The Sony Corporation, Sony Pictures, lost 10 terabytes of data before someone told them they had a problem. We hear about breaches all the time, we hear about attacks all the time, but somehow we haven't incorporated as a foundational belief that networks are going to be penetrated and that there's very little you can do with existing technology to prevent those penetrations. And it's every major American corporation, it's small American corporations, it's every governmental entity. That's not just America, it's around the world. So framing our entire discussion today should be that fact, that they will get in. That's the first fact. Second proposition is that among those who are getting in are nation states. Nation states are attacking private American companies. That's a bit of an unfair competition. But that's what's going on. The People's Liberation Army has thousands of people systematically breaking into corporations around the world, stealing information from private companies. Information such as research and development, information that's very ephemeral, such as mergers and acquisition plans, new product plans, anything that will give Chinese companies an economic advantage, however brief. The Chinese government using its army, breaking into companies up and down this street and giving that information to Chinese companies. It's not just China. We know that the government of Russia is breaking in, usually to American government entities like the White House, like the State Department most recently, previously into the classified network of the Pentagon. But they also break into American corporations. We know that Iran is now capable of doing it, that Iran was responsible for the attack on the Saudi oil field company Aramco, where they didn't just break in, they destroyed 30,000 computers. They wiped the operating systems, the applications, they wiped everything off of 30,000 computers in a matter of minutes and turned those 30,000 endpoints into doorstops, into bricks. It was also the government of Iran that was behind the denial of service attack 2 years ago on the 8 largest American banks, an attack that successfully knocked offline the online banking functions of Bank of America, Citigroup, JP Morgan, SunTrust, Wells Fargo, on and on. And the only reason that attack stopped and the banks were able to get back online with their online services was not because the US government stopped that attack, because the US government decided not to. The US government in a meeting decided not to. It wasn't the US government that stopped the attack. It wasn't AT&T or Verizon that stopped the attack. It was the government of Iran that stopped the attack because it had made its point. Throughout the 2 weeks they were doing it, every time the US companies were beginning to get a handle on the Iranian attack, they increased the volume. And we ended up with a flood attack, a DDoS attack, that was 800% larger than any DDoS attack the world had ever seen. But it wasn't the Russian attacks, it wasn't the Chinese attacks, it wasn't the Iranian attacks that got the US government to wake up and realize that private American companies were being attacked by nation states. It was when North Korea attacked Sony Pictures. For the first time, when that happened, the President of the United States walked into the press briefing room of the White House, stood behind the presidential podium, and said, "Nation states are attacking private American companies, and we are going to retaliate." So we now know where the red line is. It's Seth Rogen movies. Third proposition, cybercrime pays. The White House issued an executive order a couple of weeks ago allowing the president to designate cyber criminals around the world so that he can go after their assets. Good luck with that. Why did he do that? Why aren't we just arresting them? These cyber criminals who are making billions of dollars by hacking into companies, stealing personal identity information around the world, taking over the accounts payable function in corporations and paying themselves, filing state income tax returns and paying themselves, mainly state income tax returns because the IRS has kind of figured it out. But for those of you who pay that small tax the New York State charges, you might want to be sure it's you that gets the claim check. Those cyber criminals that are making billions of dollars are in Russia, they're in Ukraine, they're in Romania, they're in Belarus, they're in Moldova. They're in nations that are, in effect, cyber sanctuaries. And when the FBI figures out who did it, which they frequently do, and they issue red notices through Interpol, they try to arrest them, they ask through MLAT agreements to have them arrested, well, usually the local police are unable to find them. It's because they're having vodka with them with some frequency. The local police in these countries are in on it. They get a take from cybercrime. And more than just getting a little skim from the profits, the local police in these countries, the local governments in these countries, these cyber sanctuary countries, very often call upon these cyber criminal organizations to do their dirty work for them. They're kind of a reserve force for these governments. So cybercrime pays. Probably 99% of the time. When you see an arrest, which you do occasionally, remember that there are many, 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 many more people who are being very successful in sanctuary countries, attacking here into the United States and around the world, and making billions of dollars. Fourth proposition, the Internet of Things. New abbreviation for you, the IoT. We all had to learn this new abbreviation, this new acronym. The IoT exacerbates our vulnerability to internet attack against the infrastructure. We're getting to the point where most of the internet traffic is not between human beings. It's between devices, between machines. And everything is being wired up. Everything is being networked. Trains, airplanes, pipelines, electrical power, everything. And machines are constantly talking to each other. Machines are ordering, Coke machines are ordering their own refills. Elevators are calling their own repairmen. Things that you couldn't dream of 5 years ago being sentient, partially sentient, and connected to cyberspace are all now wired up. And companies like Microsoft and Cisco and everybody are out there trying to accelerate that deployment, to create the Internet of Things. And they are doing that the same way they did the Internet in the first place, without any regard for security. And so we've gone from just having your internet accounts and your computer networks at your corporations and government agencies being vulnerable to everything you rely on all day long being vulnerable. And people are beginning to make attacks that way. The German government in December issued a report saying that among other things that were attacked last year was the control system for a steel mill. Somebody attacked the control system for a steel mill, prevented a blast furnace from shutting down properly, and significantly damaged the blast furnace and the factory. That's just the tip of the iceberg. The American attack on the enrichment facilities in Iran also proved what can be done. That even when a plant is not connected to the internet, a cyber attack can occur that destroys facilities, physically destroys facilities. So the fifth proposition, sharing data between and among companies, sharing data between companies and the government might help deal with some of these issues. Might. But we haven't been able to do that. In large measure, because people don't trust the government, and in large measure, because corporate lawyers have been telling their clients in the private sector that they're vulnerable for being sued if they share data. So, there is a bipartisan bill which has passed the House. It might actually pass the Senate. I know, imagine, a bill passing the House and the Senate. When was the last time you saw that? In that cartoon when you were in high school, right? How a bill becomes an act. Well, we may have an act this year. We may have an act. And I know people have problems with the bill. They fear that somehow consumer individual information will be revealed to the government. Actually, if you look at the bill, it doesn't do that. And there are safeguards to prevent that. Other people are afraid that corporations will be sued if they participate, but if you look at the bill, it provides safe harbor. So if a company participates in an information sharing program, even one among companies without any government involvement, they get safe harbor from liability. That is the beginning of something interesting, because companies can then share with each other in near real time the IP addresses of attacks that are going after their networks. And why that is important is these attacks now pop up from IP addresses in the cloud. The attacker owns the attack site for half an hour, makes the attack, smashes, grabs, gets the information, brings it back, downloads it, and then that IP address and that account go away. The cloud's a beautiful thing, especially if you're a criminal or a hacker and you don't want to be traced. So getting those IP addresses, getting the locations of attackers as well as the techniques of attacks, getting them in real time and sharing them among companies and having systems that can pop up quickly and block the attacks is important. So this information sharing bill is important. Sixth proposition. There is a lack of clarity right now about what the US government thinks is its role in defending private American companies. The president said when Sony Pictures was attacked by North Korea that he didn't like foreign governments attacking US companies, and he was going to retaliate in that case. But he didn't establish any criteria for when he's going to retaliate, or what the US government's role should be when a company is attacked. Sometimes when a company is attacked, the FBI tells it. Sometimes when a company is attacked, it gets a little bit of help from the FBI or Homeland Security, Secret Service, particularly if it's in the defense industry. The defense industry gets a little information sharing that other private companies don't get from the government. But what the role of the government is in defending private American companies is not clear. And if you are a CEO or a CISO in an American company, you know that you can't count on the government when you're attacked by a foreign nation state or an individual hacker. There's a lack of clear public policy on this issue. My seventh proposition is that private American companies could potentially benefit from choosing to be defended in part by the US government. If the government had that public policy that articulated what its role was, and if it said, for example, the US government will defend major American banks, then an American bank, a major American bank like Citibank, could elect on a voluntary basis to go into some program of cooperation with the US government to help defend itself against those attacks. Right now, you can't. But you can imagine a policy that the president could articulate that would put criteria out for what kinds of companies, critical infrastructure companies, could be defended if they wanted to be, and what the government might do. The reason the FBI comes and knocks on your door and tells you you've been breached is because they know. They saw the attack. The government saw the attack. The government saw the attack leaving the attacker in Belarus. They saw your data flowing back across the internet. And as your precious data left the United States and flew back into Belarus, the US government watched it go by and did nothing. What would the US government do today if a terrible cyber organization in the United States, if not the world? Oh yeah, FBI has an increasingly capable program in cyberspace. DHS has an increasingly capable program in cyberspace. But it's NSA that sees these attacks coming and going. It's NSA that has by far the most talented and capable people in the US government. We may not like that, but that's where we are today. We're trying to hire people at DHS. We're trying to train people up in other agencies. But today, your tax dollars have created a significant cyber capability for offense and defense. And it's NSA. You can call it Cyber Command if you'd like. You can call it NSA. It's largely the same thing. The ninth proposition is that nobody trusts NSA. I think that's wrong. Mike Morrell, who you'll hear from next, Mike Morrell and I and 3 other colleagues at the President's request spent a lot of time last year examining NSA, looking into all the accusations about what it was up to. And we didn't find them breaking the law. Far from it. We found them almost stumbling over the hundreds of lawyers that they have on staff. Yes, hundreds of lawyers that they have on staff. For those of you at the law school, there's a future. You can work for NSA. But despite all of that, oversight, internal oversight, they're not trusted. I was at the RSA conference last week, and Jay Johnson, the Homeland Security Secretary, suggested that wouldn't it be nice if the US government could go to the courts and get a warrant to decrypt things? And he was almost booed off the stage. There's not a snowball's chance in hell that Silicon Valley will allow anything like that to happen because of the distrust of NSA. We can argue about why that distrust has occurred, but it's there. And so the most capable organization we as taxpayers have built to defend this country against cyber attack, against those cyber criminals, against those nation states that are attacking our companies, against those people who could go after the Internet of Things and shut them down. That organization really cannot play in the defensive game to the full extent that we might like it to, because we don't trust it. So the 10th and final proposition is that we need a public dialogue. We need a policy dialogue that allows us to explore what the role of government should be in defending against these threats, and that explores what the safeguards are, what the oversight is, what the transparency would be that would make us, as a nation, satisfied that using NSA and using other governmental agencies to defend us in cyberspace would not enable Big Brother, would not make us more in danger of losing our privacy information, would not infringe on our civil liberties. It cannot be beyond the realm of all of our collective capabilities to design a way that would satisfy us. And yet no one has really tried. If we don't try, if we don't figure out a way to satisfy this conundrum of, on the one hand, being in danger, and on the other hand, not being willing or able to use the only organization that's capable of addressing that danger, then we are going to continue to lose hundreds of billions of dollars to criminals, lose intellectual property to foreign governments, lose international competition, economic competition to foreign companies, and have at risk the basic infrastructure that increasingly runs this country. So you see how all those 10 propositions kind of come together at the end that way? I don't have the answer, but I do think that's the problem. And I think identifying the problem is apparently hard because I don't hear a lot of people doing it. That's the problem you should be talking about today, and Karen has nicely designed the program so you are. That's the problem that this conference is about. How do we achieve cybersecurity over those things that we need to achieve cybersecurity for without endangering our civil liberties and without giving up our privacy rights? How do we allow the US government, our government, to do something significant to reduce this really quite important threat that we may only have just seen the beginning of? So, now that I've given you the problem and not the answer, let me stop there. And Karen, do we have some time for a few questions? Okay. Dan.
There was a report in Bloomberg a couple months ago about J.P. Morgan that was pretty eye-opening, at least for me, talking about its cyber unit, staffed by hundreds and hundreds of people, run by 2 retired Air Force generals, headquarters built next to Fort Meade so they could recruit NSA people. Is that what all major U.S. corporations need to do now, given this policy uncertainty? And is that a positive thing? You know, from the perspective of a J.P. Morgan shareholder, should I view that favorably? And from the perspective of just an American, should I view that favorably?
Well, fortunately or unfortunately, all American companies can't be J.P. Morgan. If you recall, Jamie Dimon, the CEO there, to reassure shareholders, put a full-page ad in the Wall Street Journal saying, on cybersecurity, I have 1,000 people working full-time in the company, and I'm spending $250 million this year on cybersecurity. 2 weeks later, they were hacked. And so Jamie Dimon held a press conference at which he said, no, it's not $250 million I'm spending a year on cybersecurity. It's $500 million a year I'm now spending. So doubled the budget. I think J.P. Morgan is a great example. You know, its cybersecurity efforts are led by a former Air Force commander, great guy, Greg Rattray, who's doing as good a job as anybody can. But even with all of that money being spent, even with all of those, it's literally over 1,000 people full-time, in-house people working, they were hacked. And that's my first proposition. They're going to get in. The bad guys, whoever they are, in that case, are going to get in. And we cannot expect most American companies to deploy that kind of defense, to spend that amount of money to defend themselves. It's just not viable to ask a private American company to defend itself against a nation state. How many American companies can spend $500 million on cybersecurity? How many American companies make $500 million? So J.P. Morgan is in some ways atypical, but in other ways it's typical, because it's being asked to defend itself against nation-state attacks. And you can see what that means in terms of expenditures and personnel. So I think it proves my proposition that companies can't do this. Yes, sir.
It's my understanding that the U.S. government complains bitterly about hacking from others, and at the same time is both developing and utilizing hacking capacities. Is that bad? Is it, or is it flat out hypocritical, or is it more like complaining about aggression of others while building up your own defensive capacities?
So I think this is a very important point, because our Chinese friends, when you get them alone in a room and you say you're hacking, you're stealing our information, they say no. And then you say, oh, come on. And there's no one listening. Ha-ha. And then they say, well, you do too. Of course we hack, but there's a fundamental difference between what the United States government does and what the Chinese government does. And this points out the need for an international norm, I think. An international norm, maybe even a treaty. We could take the Budapest Treaty on cybercrime and expand it, clarify it. What the Chinese government does is it hacks into private companies around the world, gets industrial espionage information, and provides it to Chinese companies that then compete against the private companies in the global marketplace, compete against private companies that they've hacked. The US government doesn't do that. And in fact, the US government is prohibited from doing that by executive order. The United States doesn't hack its way into a Chinese aircraft company and give the information to Boeing. It doesn't hack its way into a Chinese pharmaceutical firm and give the information to Amgen. It doesn't do that. Now, you may not believe that. I assure you it's true. I assure you Mike and I and the other three guys that looked at NSA's operations last year satisfied ourselves that they are in complete compliance on the rules against doing that. They don't do it. And one of the reasons they don't do it is, what's an American corporation? Most American corporations today are multinational organizations. Is Siemens an American corporation? Could you give, if you spied on some Chinese company and got information valuable to Siemens, would you give it to them? Are they an American corporation? Is Boeing an American corporation? Who knows? We don't do it. It's illegal, and it doesn't happen, and it's a significant difference. It's not hypocritical. It's a significant difference between what the United States does, which is to collect information for national security purposes, and what the Chinese do, which is to collect information for economic benefit. Big difference. Yes, sir.
You're right. I don't trust the NSA, and I suspect most American citizens share that now. So my question, but I hear you on the necessity for building a trust if the NSA, in fact, is the only entity that can protect us. So my question is, do you have any tangible suggestions in terms of trust-building measures that the government might take to reach out to us, given what they've been doing to us?
I think if NSA were to help private American companies defend themselves, that we'd have to have transparency as to how they were doing it, and a way to satisfy ourselves that information that the companies have about us as consumers, or information the companies have about us in any way, doesn't get to the government. That there is a technology that strips off and anonymizes personally identifiable information. That's not hard. It was hard a few years ago, but there are companies today that have demonstrated. One of them is a startup I met last week called TruStar, T-R-U-S-T-A-R, that has technology that strips off PII information out of network traffic. And so if all you're giving the government is information about the attacks that you've been experiencing and where they're coming from, then I don't think consumers need to worry. But you shouldn't have to take my word for it or the word of, 5 guys who used to work in the White House. There ought to be a panel that everybody can trust. I don't know if you can find people that everybody can trust in this country, but a balance of people who collectively people can trust, that on an ongoing, continuous monitoring basis, look at the activities of the government and certify that they're consistent with laws and directives. I don't think that's hard. I think we could do it. But it means having this continuous monitoring of the government by trustworthy individuals, transparency, reporting, and clarity of rules so that we know what is and what is not permitted. Now, at the end of the day, we might all disagree about what should be permitted. In the case of the NSA review we did last year, we found the NSA wasn't breaking the law. I also thought the law was stupid. So, I mean, those are two different issues. Yes, sir.
How do you, in the broader framework of the diplomatic world and the economic world, say, as you mentioned, Iran, vis-a-vis the P5+1 talks and the need to establish a normal relationship with them, and for the corporations that you cited, there's no trust of the big financials, and they have earned that lack of trust. How do you suggest that we begin to put them in a situation?
Well, in answer to the first question, on the international side, I think we need to build on the Budapest Convention, which is not everybody is a member of, certainly Russia's not. And the Budapest Convention is a first step in cyber arms control, if you will. It establishes some norms with regard to cyber crime. I think we need to build it out. It's going to take a long time. And there are problems with cyber arms control because verification is going to be hard and all of that. But I did arms control for 25 years. Conventional arms control in Europe, SALT, chemical weapons arms control, biological weapons arms control. Every time we started negotiations on any new field of arms control, chemical, biological, whatever, the critics said, you'll never get there. Too hard. That's not an area where you can do arms control. You won't be able to do verification. Don't bother trying. And sometimes it took 20 years. Literally, I worked on one treaty, the conventional forces in Europe, for 20 years. We took baby steps to get there. And I think that's what we do with arms control international norms in cyberspace. We take baby steps. We have small agreements on transparency, small agreements on international norms, on communications back and forth. We're really not doing that very well. And if it's going to take 20 years, we should start already, right? Well, time for one more?
You said that you thought the NSA had not broken the law in your examination, but also that you questioned the quality of the laws. And obviously, Congress has been talking about whether the quality of the laws are very poor. Would you suggest, or have you suggested, areas where you think reform would be good in the areas where you're not so satisfied?
Yeah, and I don't mean to speak for Mike because he's going to come up here in a minute and he can correct me, so I'm speaking for myself. But I think we found that the program called telephony metadata, otherwise known as Section 215, was actually badly drafted both by the Congress and by the court. And that what it ended up with was bulk collection of everyone, potentially, everyone's records every time you picked up the phone. What was recorded and stored by the government was the to and from and duration data of phone calls in the United States. I thought that was unnecessary. I don't think it was particularly productive. I think the fact that it was done in secret contributes to this lack of trust of NSA. And I think that what we suggested was going forward, the government should not be holding that data. If the government wants that kind of data, it can go to the court. In my experience in government, when you needed a warrant in a terrorism case, you could get it pretty damn fast, including at 3 o'clock in the morning if you needed it. And the law also provides that you can get the warrant after the fact in an emergency, if you can later certify it was an emergency. And you can then use the data once you've certified with a judge that you collected it under an emergency circumstance. So I think that's one example in our report where we suggested some changes. We actually suggested 46 changes, and all of them are online in our report. Most of them, I think, are that the president can implement, have been implemented, or in the process of being implemented. Some of them are going to require congressional action. The Patriot Act expires next month, unless it is continued by the Congress. Congress probably won't get around to doing that, so they'll probably extend it for 60 or 90 days to give themselves some time. But at least it's my hope that it's not extended without some modification, particularly with regard to that program. That was the last question. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dick. You told me you were going to not say anything upsetting.